In the spring of 1861, along the tobacco fields of Hanover County, Virginia, a woman named Ruth, accomplished what the Commonwealth's court records would later describe only as a most heinous act of insurrection. The truth, buried beneath decades of shame and deliberate forgetting, was far more complex than a single line in a ledger could capture. Colonel Harrison Whitfield, aged 47, master of Ashbourne plantation and owner of nearly 200 souls, was found hanging from a rope beam in the attic of his own manor house, placed there by the hands of a woman he had claimed as property for 16 years. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South, narratives that reveal not heroism, but the profound moral rot that slavery carved into the heart of a nation. Ashbourne sat like a monument to wealth extracted from human suffering, its white columns rising above 1,500 acres of prime tobacco land. The plantation had belonged to the Whitfield family since 1798, passed from father to son with the meticulous care reserved for emperies. Harrison Whitfield inherited the estate in 1843 upon his father's death, along with 173 enslaved men, women, and children whose names appeared in inventory ledgers beside livestock and furniture. By 1861, that number had grown to 198 through births, purchases, and what the colonel called natural increase, a euphemism that disguised the systematic rape and forced breeding that occurred in the quarters beyond the big house. The colonel himself was a man of contradictions that the slave-holding South produced with disturbing regularity, educated at the College of William and Mary, well-versed in classical literature, a vestryman at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. He spoke eloquently about honor, duty, and Christian stewardship. His library contained works by Aristotle, Cicero, and Thomas Aquinas. He wrote letters to the Richmond, encouraged defending the peculiar institution as a civilizing force, a sacred trust placed upon Southern gentlemen to guide an inferior race toward eventual fitness for freedom. Though that eventual day, he assured his readers, lay generations hence, yet this same man, who wept openly at the funeral of his childhood nurse, maintained a small wooden building behind the tobacco barns where enslaved people were whipped, sometimes by his own hand, for infractions as minor as looking him directly in the eye or failing to step aside quickly enough on a path. His wife, Catherine Whitfield, née Randolph, was 39 in 1861, a delicate woman whose family pedigree connected her to the first families of Virginia. She had been raised to manage a household, play the pianoforte with appropriate skill, and produce heirs. She had fulfilled two of these duties admirably. The third had proven her greatest sorrow. In 18 years of marriage, Catherine had suffered 7 miscarriages and delivered only one living child, a daughter named Margaret, now 16. The lack of a male heir haunted the colonel with an intensity that bordered on obsession. In the South of that era, a man's worth was measured not merely in acres and slaves, but in sons who would carry his name forward. Without a boy to inherit Ashbourne, the colonel faced the unbearable prospect that his line would end. His estate would pass to distant cousins, and his life's work would dissolve into irrelevance. Ruth had been born on the plantation in 1829, making her 32 years old in that fatal spring. Her mother, Dinah, had worked in the big house as a seamstress until her death from fever in 1837. Ruth never knew her father, though the lighter tone of her skin and the straight texture of her hair spoke to questions she had learned never to voice. She had grown up, moving between the quarters and the main house, trained from childhood in the intricate rituals of domestic service. By 15, she was lady's maid to Catherine Whitfield, responsible for dressing hair, maintaining wardrobes, and attending to the private needs of the mistress. She could read, having been taught covertly by Catherine herself, in violation of Virginia law, a secret both women kept, though for different reasons. Ruth's intelligence was evident to anyone who spent time in her presence. She understood the rhythms of the household better than the colonel himself. She knew when Catherine's headaches would strike, could predict the colonel's moods by the weight of his footsteps, and managed the other house servants with kite efficiency. She was also beautiful, though that beauty had brought her nothing but suffering. Tall and slender, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to hold both depth and distance, she moved through the house like a ghost, present but somehow apart, essential but invisible. The others in her circle represented the small universe of the enslaved at Ashbourne. There was Samuel, 41, the head driver, who managed the field hands and served as the colonel's proxy in matters of labor and discipline. Samuel carried the weight of impossible choices, enforcing the master's will to protect himself and his family from worse overseers the colonel might hire. His wife, Hester, 38, cooked in the big house kitchen and had raised Ruth after Dinah's death. Their son, Moses, 23, worked in the stables and possessed a quiet dignity that made him dangerous in the colonel's eyes. There was also Celia, 19, recently purchased from a neighboring plantation, who worked in the dairy and gardens. She was pregnant that spring, though whether by choice or force, no record states. Then there was old Benjamin, 67, too frail for field work, but kept on to tend the smoke house and tell stories to the children in the quarters. And there was Lydia, 28, Ruth's closest confidante, who worked as a spinner and weaver, and whose sharp wit provided the only laughter Ruth ever knew. The catalyst for what followed occurred on Easter Sunday, 1861. Virginia had seceded from the Union just 2 weeks prior, and men throughout the county were forming militia companies, drunk on visions of martial glory. The colonel, too old for soldiering himself, had donated considerable funds to equip a local cavalry unit and spent the holiday meal holding forth about Southern rights and Northern aggression. Catherine sat pale and silent, picking at her food. Margaret, their daughter, seemed distracted, her eyes drifting toward the windows. After dinner, the colonel retreated to his study with a bottle of bourbon. He summoned Ruth, under the pretense of needing the room dusted. What occurred in that study had occurred dozens of times before over the years. The colonel believed, as many masters did, that the women he owned existed for his use in all capacities. He believed he was entitled to their bodies as surely as he was entitled to the fruit from his orchards. Ruth had learned long ago that resistance meant pain, not just for herself, but for others she loved. Samuel might be sold away. Hester might be sent to the fields. The complex mathematics of survival under slavery meant that sometimes the only choice was submission. Pause for a moment and reflect on what it meant to live in a world where even your body was not your own, where the most intimate violations were sanctioned by law and justified by scripture, where resistance could mean death not only for you, but for everyone you loved. But that Easter Sunday introduced a new horror. The colonel, deep in his cups and morose about his lack of an heir, Mother Ruth a proposition. He told her that he had given the matter considerable thought and prayer. He believed that God had denied him a son through his wife because the Randolph bloodline was too weak, too refined, too diminished by generations of intermarriage among the Tidewater aristocracy. What he needed, he explained with the calm confidence of a man who believed himself both rational and righteous, was to introduce a stronger blood into his line. Ruth, he said, would bear him a son. This child would not be acknowledged publicly, of course, but would be raised in the big house, educated, and eventually manumitted with enough resources to make his own way. The colonel framed this as an act of mercy, even generosity. Ruth said nothing in that study. She had learned that speaking was dangerous. She nodded, gathered the dusting cloths she had never used, and left. But something broke in her that day, some final thread of endurance that had been fraying for years. She walked through the house and down to the quarters, moving mechanically through evening tasks. When she finally spoke to Lydia that night, sitting in the darkness of the cabin they shared, her voice was flat and distant. "He means to breed me like one of his mares," she said. "He's been doing it all along, but now he's given it a purpose. Now I'm supposed to be grateful." Lydia took her hand but offered no false comfort. They both knew there was no authority to appeal to, no law that protected them, no rescue coming. Catherine Whitfield might have had the power to intervene, but Ruth had observed the mistress long enough to know she had trained herself not to see certain things. Willful blindness was the price of a Southern lady's position. Over the following weeks, Ruth was called to the colonel's settee with increasing frequency. He was systematic in his approach, keeping a calendar, consulting texts on agriculture and breeding. He spoke to her as though she were a partner in an experiment rather than a human being whose autonomy had been obliterated. Sometimes he would discuss his theories about bloodlines and inheritance, about the supposed characteristics of different races and how they might be combined for optimal results. He seemed genuinely to believe he was engaged in something scientific, even nobly. The plantation continued its rhythms around this private atrocity. In the fields, enslaved laborers planted tobacco seedlings in the warming soil. In the big house, Catherine Whitfield planned a party to celebrate the Confederacy's early victories. Margaret practiced her embroidery and exchanged furtive glances with young men at church. The war that would ultimately destroy the South's entire social order was still in its optimistic infancy, and at Ashbourne the routines of mastery and bondage seemed eternal and inevitable. By mid-May, Ruth knew she was pregnant. She told no one, not even Lydia at first. She moved through her duties with the same quiet efficiency, but those who knew her well noticed a change. She had become even more silent, more removed. Samuel, whose own daughter had been sold away years earlier to settle a debt, recognized the look of someone making calculations, making impossible choices. The colonel was jubilant when Ruth confirmed her condition. He began making plans, speaking of a small cottage he would have built near the quarters, of arranging for the child to be raised with every advantage. He seemed oblivious to the revulsion in Ruth's eyes, or perhaps he simply didn't recognize it as such. To him, gratitude and compliance looked the same. In a society where even love was property, where parenthood could be a weapon and children could be a currency. The line between civilization and barbarism revealed itself as nothing more than a comfortable lie. White Southerners told themselves to sleep at night. Ruth began spending more time in the attic of the big house, ostensibly organizing the stored furniture and trunks that accumulated in such spaces. In truth, she was studying the beams, the ropes used to secure trunks, the layout of the space. She moved with a purpose now, though she revealed that purpose to no one. She knew that her pregnancy would not save her, that after the child was born, if it was male, she would likely be sold away to avoid complications or questions. She had seen this pattern before on other plantations. The child would be raised as an orphan of mysterious origin, given some plausible story, and she would disappear into the vast machinery of domestic slave trading that moved human beings across the South like cargo. On June 17, 1861, Ruth asked the colonel to come to the attic. She told him there was a trunk she couldn't move, something he needed to see regarding his father's papers. It was late afternoon, the house drowsy in the heat. Catherine was resting with one of her headaches. Margaret was at a neighbor's. The house servants were occupied with their tasks in the lower floors. What happened in that attic has been pieced together from fragments, from the physical evidence, from Ruth's own brief testimony before she was hanged, from the whispered accounts that survived in the quarters and were passed down through generations. Ruth did not overpower the colonel through strength. She was 7 weeks pregnant and half his weight. Instead, she used his own assumptions about her helplessness against him. When he ascended to the attic and bent over the trunk she indicated, she struck him on the back of the head with a piece of iron, a handle from an old stove stored among the cast-offs. He fell forward, stunned, but not unconscious. In the struggle that followed, Ruth managed to loop a rope around his neck, one of the thick ropes used to secure cargo. She pulled with every ounce of strength she possessed, driven by 16 years of accumulated rage and desperation. The colonel, confused and hampered by the blow to his head, couldn't effectively fight back. When he finally went limp, Ruth hauled his body up, using a pulley system designed for lifting furniture, tying the rope to a beam. She arranged him carefully, methodically, even tucking his vest buttons properly. Then she descended the attic stairs, closed the door behind her, and went back to work. It was Samuel who discovered the body the next morning when the colonel failed to appear for breakfast, and Catherine asked him to search. The scene was unmistakable. This was no accident. The household erupted into chaos. Catherine collapsed. Margaret screamed. The house servants, ecstatic in terror, knowing that the death of a master meant investigation, interrogation, and likely collective punishment. Ruth never tried to run. She sat quietly in her cabin, waiting. When Samuel came to ask if she had seen anything unusual, she told him simply, "He did it. It's finished now." Consider what it means to choose death over continuation, to reach a point where execution seems preferable to one more day of existence under conditions that denied every aspect of your humanity. Consider that this choice was made not in hot rage, but in cold calculation, and ask yourself what extremity of suffering produces such clarity. The trial, if it could be called that, was swift. Virginia law provided no real judicial process for enslaved people accused of murdering their masters. Ruth was held in the county jail for 3 days while a panel of justices determined their fate. She was not permitted to testify on her own behalf, though the magistrate did ask her if she had accomplices. She said she did not. When asked why she had done it, she said only, "He was making me bear his child. I couldn't do it anymore." This statement caused considerable discomfort among the justices, not because they doubted its truth, but because it forced them to acknowledge openly what the system normally kept hidden. The rape of enslaved women by their masters was so common as to be unremarkable, yet speaking of it directly threatened the elaborate fictions that sustained the plantation order. The magistrate quickly moved past Ruth's explanation and focused on the crime itself. She was sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out within the week as an example to other enslaved people in the county. The speed was deliberate. There could be no time for sympathy to develop, no opportunity for the case to become complicated by outside interference. Catherine Whitfield did not attend the execution. She remained in a room at Ashbourne, sedated with laudanum, surrounded by what remained of her world. Margaret left Virginia soon after to live with relatives in Charleston and never returned. The plantation itself was sold in 1862 to pay the colonel's debts. The enslaved people dispersed to other buyers, families torn apart in the final settling of accounts. Ruth was hanged on June 25, 1861, in the courthouse square in Hanover. A crowd of white onlookers gathered to witness the spectacle, to see order restored and property rights vindicated. The enslaved people in the crowd were forced to watch as well. The lesson of consequences made visceral and public. Ruth walked to the scaffold without assistance, her head high, her face composed. The executioner asked if she had any last words. She said, "I am not sorry, I only wish she had done it sooner." Then she was gone. The records state that her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the potter's field. No monument marked her passing. No newspaper published an obituary. The official narrative insisted that she was simply a murderer, an aberration, proof of the dangers that lurked when masters were not sufficiently vigilant. But in the quarters, in the kitchens, in the small spaces where enslaved people spoke truths they could never voice publicly, Ruth became something else. She became a name whispered with a mixture of awe and grief, evidence that resistance was possible even when it meant certain death. The child she carried died with her, never given the chance to draw breath in a world that would have claimed ownership of its very existence. What Ruth did was not heroism in any simple sense. It was an act born of absolute desperation, a final assertion of will in a system designed to eradicate will entirely. She chose to end one life and her own rather than continue in an existence that had become unbearable. In the decades after the Civil War, when Ashbourne Plantation lay in ruins and the Whitfield name faded into obscurity, when the entire architecture of slavery had collapsed and former slaves were attempting to build lives from the rubble, Ruth's story survived in fragments. Some versions held that she had been avenging other women in the quarters. Others claimed the colonel had threatened to sell her family. Still others said she had been in love with someone else, another enslaved man, and the colonel's attentions had destroyed that relationship. The details shifted with each telling, but the core remained constant. A woman had said no in the only way left to her, and had paid the ultimate price for that refusal. If you search for Ruth today in the historical records of Virginia, you'll find little. There is a brief notation in the Hanover County Court records for June 1861, listing the conviction and execution of a Negro woman named Ruth, property of the late Harrison Whitfield, for murder. There are the estate papers showing the sale of Ashbourne and its enslaved population. There is Harrison Whitfield's gravestone in the churchyard at St. Paul's Episcopal, which reads, "Taken from us in the prime of his life, a devoted servant of Virginia and the Confederacy, a Christian gentleman mourned by all who knew him." There is no marker for Ruth, no grave you can visit, no place where you can stand and pay respects or seek forgiveness on behalf of a society that treated human beings as chattel. She exists now only in days recovered fragments, in the oral stories passed down through families who remembered, and in the terrible truth of what slavery required of both the enslaved and the enslavers. The story of Ruth forces us to confront the mechanisms of power that sustain slavery, not through abstract political theory, but through the intimate violence visited upon bodies and souls. It reveals how the system corrupted those who benefited from it, transforming educated men who spoke of honor and duty into rapists, who convinced themselves they were acting righteously. It shows how white women's willful blindness made them complicit in horrors committed in their own homes. It demonstrates how slavery extracted not just labor, but every form of human dignity, until some people could see no path forward except through blood. Perhaps most disturbing is how unremarkable Ruth's story was. She was one woman on one plantation in one county, of one estate where this kind of atrocity was occurring continuously, sanctioned by law and custom, upheld by church and court. Multiply her story by tens of thousands, by hundreds of thousands, across decades and generations, and you begin to approach the true scale of what slavery meant, not as an economic system or a political arrangement, but as a daily assault on human beings' most basic right to exist with autonomy and dignity. The South, that Harrison Whitfield fought to preserve, through his money if not his body, was destroyed in the war that had just begun when he died. The Confederacy, as celebrated at that Easter dinner, would collapse 4 years later, its armies defeated, its economy in ruins, its entire social order dismantled. The enslaved people he had owned as property would become free citizens, though that freedom would be contested and constrained by new forms of oppression that extended slavery's legacy well into the 20th century and beyond. But Ruth did not live to see that freedom. She died in bondage, executed for the crime of refusing to be bred like livestock, of asserting that her body belonged to herself, even when the law declared otherwise. Her act of resistance did not free anyone else. It did not strike a blow for justice or advance the cause of abolition. It was purely personal, purely about her own desperate need to reclaim some measure of control over her own existence, even if that control lasted only minutes. These stories, and there are so many of them, buried in archives, hidden in family silences, preserved only in the folk memories of descendants, reveal the moral price of slavery in its most personal dimensions. They show us that the system's violence was not incidental or exceptional, but foundational and constant. They demonstrate that the masters who owned other human beings were not simply economic actors pursuing profit, but people who had convinced themselves that absolute power over others was their birthright ordained by God and nature. And they remind us that the enslaved people who suffer under the system were not passive victims waiting for liberation, but human beings making impossible choices every day, finding small ways to resist and large ways to rebel, sometimes surviving and sometimes choosing death over continued subjection. Ruth's decision to kill rather than bear her master's child was not the action of someone who lacked courage or hope. It was the action of someone who had reached the limits of endurance and chose to draw a line, consequences be damned. If this story has troubled you, if it has made you uncomfortable or angry or sad, then it has done its work. The purpose of excavating these stories is not to create entertainment from suffering, but to refuse the comfortable amnesia that would prefer to forget what slavery actually meant, not in sanitized textbooks or nostalgic films, but in the lived reality of people trapped in a system that treated them as things. The South spent generations trying to bury stories like Ruth's, trying to construct a mythology of king masters and contented slaves, of a gracious civilization destroyed by northern aggression. These stories shatter that mythology and force us to see the violence at the heart of the system. Ruth of Virginia, who hanged her master in the attic of the big house in the spring of 1861, deserves to be remembered not as an aberration, but as someone who made visible the violence that was always present but usually hidden. She deserves to be remembered as a human being who reached the point where existence under the terms offered to her became intolerable, and who made the only choice she could see to asset her own humanity one final time. The rope that hanged her at the courthouse square has long since rotted away. The scaffold has been dismantled. The ground where she was buried has been built over, the unmarked grave lost to time. But her story remains, a testament to the thousands of stories like hers that the South tried to erase, and a reminder that beneath every grand plantation house and every genteel narrative of Southern honor lay a foundation of unimaginable suffering and systematic cruelty. This is the legacy we inherit. These are the ghosts that haunt us still. And until we fully reckon with the stories like Ruth's, until we acknowledge the full horror of what slavery was and the long shadow it continues to cast, we cannot hope to understand the America we inhabit today, or build the more just society we claim to seek. The plantation bell at Ashbourne no longer rings. The fields have returned to forest. The big house collapsed decades ago, its columns fallen, its attic where a desperate woman struck her final blow against bondage now open to the sky. Nature has reclaimed what humans built on the backs of stolen labor and stolen lives. But the stories remain, waiting to be told, demanding to be heard, insisting that we remember not the mythology, but the truth.